Emma wiped sweat from her forehead, exhaustion weighing on her like a heavy chain. She had been cleaning floors at Bradford International Airport for hours, invisible to the rushing crowds. Just as she reached Gate 14, a sharp, strangled gasp cut through the noise. Her eyes snapped to an elderly man, his hand clutching his chest, fingers digging into his shirt, his face contorted in agony. He tried to call for help, but no one stopped. They just walked away. Emma froze. Was he dying? Before the story begins, make sure to subscribe to the channel and leave your thoughts in the comments. Let's begin. Emma's breath hitched as she watched the elderly man struggle for air. His fingers trembled against his chest, his body slumped forward, and his lips turned pale. He tried to say something, but no words came out, only a desperate, strangled gasp. Her heart pounded. Was this really happening? She looked around, expecting someone, anyone, to rush to his aid. However, people just walked past, some throwing quick glances, while others pretended not to notice. A businessman checked his watch and turned away. A woman with a rolling suitcase hesitated, but then walked faster, as if afraid of getting involved. Emma felt anger bubble in her chest. How could they just ignore him? Her mind screamed at her to move, but her feet felt frozen. She had no medical training, no experience. What if she made things worse? However, the man's body suddenly jerked slightly, his head tilting back as his eyes rolled upward. She could not wait. He needed help now. Emma rushed forward, dropping to her knees beside him. "Sir? Can you hear me?" She shook his shoulder gently, but he did not respond. His breathing was shallow and uneven. Her hands trembled as she looked around frantically. "Help! This man needs help!" she shouted, but her voice barely rose above the airport noise. No one came. Her pulse pounded in her ears. She had seen something like this before, on television, in movies. But now it was real. Life and death, real. She forced herself to think. What did they do in those medical shows? She grabbed his wrist, searching for a pulse, weak, unsteady. Then she saw something worse. His chest had stopped rising. Panic surged through her veins. He was not breathing. Her mind raced. CPR. She had to do CPR. She had never done it before, but she had seen people perform it. 30 compressions, then breaths. That was what she remembered. Hands shaking, she positioned herself over his chest, interlocking her fingers like she had seen in videos. 1, 2, 3. She pushed down, hard and fast. "Hey, what are you doing?" A man's voice cut through the noise. Emma looked up to see a security officer rushing toward her. His expression was tense and suspicious. "I am trying to save him," Emma snapped, continuing the compressions. The officer hesitated. "Step back. We will handle this." "No, he is not breathing." Emma's voice cracked. Why were they wasting time? The officer spoke into his radio. "Medical emergency at Gate 14, requesting paramedics." Emma gritted her teeth. They were not moving fast enough. "Come on," she whispered, pressing harder. Sweat dripped from her forehead. "Please do not die." The man's body suddenly jerked. A painful gasp escaped his lips. His chest rose again, struggling for air. Emma nearly collapsed from relief. Then, chaos erupted. Security officers rushed in, pushing her aside. Paramedics arrived moments later, kneeling beside the man, checking his vitals. Passengers, who had ignored him minutes ago, now gathered in a curious crowd, murmuring amongst themselves. Emma stepped back, heart racing. Had she done enough? Had she really saved him? One of the paramedics glanced at her. "Did you start compressions?" She swallowed hard. Yes." He nodded. "You might have just saved his life." A lump formed in Emma's throat. She looked at the elderly man, now being given oxygen. She did not even know his name. However, he was alive, and that was all that mattered. Emma stood frozen as the paramedics worked on the elderly man, their voices calm yet urgent. One of them placed an oxygen mask over his face, while another checked his pulse. The man's chest rose and fell weakly, but at least he was breathing. Relief washed over Emma, but it was short-lived. A firm hand grabbed her arm. She turned to see the security officer who had confronted her earlier. His grip was not aggressive, but it was firm enough to make her uneasy. "You need to come with me," he said. Emma blinked. "What? Why?" "You were the first person seen touching him. We need to ask you some questions." Her stomach dropped. "I was helping him. I saved his life." "Ma'am, I understand," he said, his tone measured. "But we have protocols." "You need to cooperate." Passengers whispered among themselves, their eyes flicking between her and the unconscious man. Emma felt heat rise to her face. Why were they looking at her like that? She had done nothing wrong. A second officer joined them. "Bring her to the security office," he instructed. "We need to review the footage and file a report." Emma's pulse spiked. Security office? Footage? She had never been in trouble before, and now she was being treated like a suspect. She looked back at the elderly man, now stable but still unconscious. The paramedics did not glance in her direction. No one defended her. The officer led her away from the scene, weaving through the airport crowds. Her breath felt shallow. Did they think she had hurt him? That made no sense. She had helped him. Inside the security office, the air was thick with tension. A row of monitors displayed live footage from different parts of the airport. An older officer sat behind a desk, arms crossed. "Name?" he asked. "Emma Carter," she said, forcing her voice to stay steady. He nodded to another officer, who typed into a computer. "You work here?" "Yes, I clean the terminals." The officer studied her. "And why did you perform CPR on that man?" Emma's jaw clenched. "Because he was dying. No one else was helping." The older officer leaned back in his chair. "You have medical training?" "No, but I have seen how CPR is done. She exhaled sharply. "I could not let him die." The younger officer turned the monitor toward her. "We reviewed the footage. You acted quickly, but we need to confirm there was no foul play." Emma's hands clenched into fists. "Foul play?" The older officer raised a brow. "The man you helped is not just anyone. He is Daniel Hawthorne." Emma stared. The name meant nothing to her. "Who?" The officers exchanged glances. "Daniel Hawthorne," the older one repeated. "Founder of Hawthorne Global Enterprises. He is one of the wealthiest men in the country." Emma's mind reeled. She had saved $1 billion? The older officer continued. "His family is extremely protective of him. If anything happens to him, we have to investigate thoroughly." Emma shook her head. "I did nothing wrong." The younger officer tapped his fingers against the desk. "We will need to wait for him to regain consciousness. Until then, you are not allowed to leave the airport." Emma's stomach twisted. She had spent years struggling just to survive. Now, after doing the right thing, she was being treated like a criminal. She folded her arms. "What if he does not remember what happened?" The older officer shrugged. "Then it depends on what his family decides." Emma swallowed hard. Had she just saved her worst nightmare? Emma sat on a stiff chair in the security office, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. The weight of their words pressed down on her. Daniel Hawthorne, a billionaire. She had no idea. She had only seen a man struggling to breathe, a man on the brink of death. And now, she was being treated like a suspect, instead of someone who had just saved his life. The room was cold, the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead. Time crawled by as officers spoke in hushed tones. She could not hear what they were saying, but their occasional glances in her direction made her skin prickle. Finally, the door swung open. A man in a sharp navy suit stepped inside. His posture was stiff, his expression unreadable. Emma knew immediately that he was not security. "I am Lucas Hawthorne," he said. His voice was clipped, precise. "Daniel Hawthorne is my father." Emma swallowed hard. His son. Lucas's gaze bore into her. "You were the one who performed CPR." Emma nodded. "Yes." For a moment, he said nothing. Then, he pulled out a chair and sat across from her, resting his hands on the table. "What exactly happened?" Emma took a deep breath, forcing herself to stay calm. I was cleaning near gate 14 when I heard a sound. When I looked, your father was clutching his chest. No one was stopping to help. I rushed over, and when I saw he was not breathing, I started CPR. Lucas studied her. His face gave nothing away. Do you have any idea who my father is? He finally asked. Emma frowned. I do now, but at the time I had no clue. Lucas leaned back slightly, tapping his fingers against the table. So, you expect me to believe that a random airport worker, who has no medical training, just happened to be in the right place at the right time and saved my father's life? Emma's jaw tightened. That is exactly what happened. Lucas let out a slow breath. Convenient. Emma felt heat rise in her chest. Are you saying I did something wrong? Lucas's eyes narrowed slightly. I am saying it is strange. My father is an important man, and he does not just have heart attacks. He has a private doctor, a controlled diet, and strict medical care. And yet, he collapsed in the middle of an airport, with a cleaning staff member being the only person to help. Emma clenched her fists. I did not make him collapse. I saved him. The door opened again, and one of the security officers stepped in. His face was unreadable. Mr. Hawthorne is awake, he announced. Emma's heart pounded. Lucas stood immediately. I want to see him. The officer nodded, then turned to Emma. You are coming too. Emma hesitated. Me? Lucas gave her a sharp look. You are involved in this. You will answer to my father directly. Emma swallowed hard but stood. She had nothing to hide. The walk to the private medical wing of the airport felt like miles. Lucas strode ahead, his back rigid, while Emma followed in tense silence. When they entered the room, Daniel Hawthorne lay in a hospital bed, hooked up to monitors. His skin looked less pale now, and his breathing was steady. His eyes flickered open, landing first on Lucas. Then slowly, they moved to Emma. For a moment, no one spoke. Then, in a hoarse voice, Daniel said, You saved my life. Emma exhaled, her shoulders relaxing slightly. Yes. Lucas stepped closer. Father, do you remember anything? What happened before you collapsed? Daniel frowned slightly, as if trying to recall. I remember a sharp pain in my chest. I tried to call for help, but everything became blurry. And then, his gaze returned to Emma. I remember her voice. I remember pressure on my chest. And then, I could breathe again. Emma watched as his expression changed, confusion shifting into something else. Realization. His voice was stronger when he spoke again. You saved my life, he repeated. Emma nodded. I just did what I could. Lucas was quiet, studying his father's face. Then, after a long pause, Daniel turned to him. Lucas, he said, his voice firm despite the exhaustion in his eyes. I want to talk to her. Alone. Lucas's expression barely changed, but Emma saw the flicker of hesitation in his eyes. After a moment, he gave a tight nod. Of course. He left without another word. Now it was just Emma and Daniel Hawthorne. He looked at her for a long moment before speaking. Do you have any idea what you have done? Emma's stomach tightened. A faint smile touched his lips. You have changed everything. Emma's heart pounded in her chest. Changed everything? What did he mean? Daniel Hawthorne studied her, his sharp eyes filled with something she could not quite place. He looked tired, but there was a weight in his gaze, a realization, a decision already forming. You saved my life, he repeated, his voice steadier now. Not because you wanted anything. Not because you knew who I was. You just saw a dying man and acted. Emma swallowed. I could not just stand there and do nothing. A slow smile spread across his face. That is exactly the kind of person I have spent my entire life looking for. She frowned. I do not understand. He shifted slightly in the bed, wincing as he adjusted himself. My company, Hawthorne Global Enterprises, is more than just business. I have spent years trying to find people with real integrity, people who do the right thing, even when no one is watching. He paused. Most people, when they see a stranger in trouble, walk away. You did not. Emma shook her head. I do not need anything, if that is what you are thinking. I was just doing what anyone should have done. Daniel chuckled, though the sound was weak, and yet no one else did. The weight of his words settled over her. He was right. The airport had been filled with people who had glanced at him, people who had hesitated, people who had chosen not to get involved. But she had moved. She had acted. Daniel took a breath. I want to offer you something. Emma tensed. What? His expression was unreadable. A job. She blinked. A job? He nodded. Not cleaning airport terminals. Something better. Something you deserve. Emma hesitated. But I do not have a degree. I do not have experience. Daniel's gaze didn't waver. What you have is far more valuable. You have courage. You have integrity. And I can teach you the rest. Her pulse quickened. But why? Because people like you deserve more than struggling to survive. And because if I can help change your life the way you changed mine, then I am going to do it. Emma's breath caught in her throat. This could not be real. People like her did not get opportunities like this. They did not get noticed by billionaires, let alone receive job offers from them. She searched his face, looking for any sign that this was some kind of test or trick, but all she saw was sincerity. A lump formed in her throat. I do not know what to say. Daniel smiled. Say yes. Emma hesitated for only a moment before she whispered, yes. The door opened, and Lucas stepped back inside. His sharp gaze flicked between them. Everything all right? Daniel nodded. More than all right. I just made an important decision. Lucas raised an eyebrow. What decision? Daniel's smile widened as he turned back to Emma. I am hiring her. Lucas's expression barely changed, but Emma saw the flicker of surprise in his eyes. You are hiring her? Daniel nodded. She saved my life. Now I am giving her a chance to change hers. Lucas studied Emma for a long moment, before finally giving a slow nod. Then I guess we will be seeing more of each other. Emma felt her chest tighten. Everything had changed in a single moment. She had gone from being a struggling cleaner to standing in front of one of the most powerful men in the country, with a future she never could have imagined. She had stepped in to save a life, and in return, hers was about to begin.